Hello, everybody. I'm Steve Silverstein, the Associate Chair for Research in Psychiatry, and welcome to our first Engel Rounds presentation of the year. This was the Grand Rounds series. That's the fourth Wednesday of the month. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'm going to just review some of the usual procedural issues that are important for these presentations. So first, just want to remind everyone your microphones are off and the cameras are off as well for the presentation. And when we encourage people to ask questions during or at the end of the talk, and to do that, please use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. We're trying to save the chat box for communications between the speaker and the interpreters and Steve Fasson. So remember to use the question and answer box. And then very importantly, we would like everybody's feedback on this and all presentations really, but for this one, there'll be a link that's put up near the end of the talk and at the very end. An email will be sent out tomorrow. So please provide feedback. It's very helpful to us in planning this series. Today, we have a very interesting talk here. Our presenter is Michelle Carr, Ph.D., who is a postdoctoral fellow in our Department of Psychiatry. And I'd like to just say, her presentation, I should say, is Brain and Behavior Mechanisms of Nightmares and Nightmare Treatment. I wanted to say a few words about Michelle for the people who may not know her. So in addition to being a postdoc, she's the assistant director of the Sleep and Neurophysiology Research Laboratory here in our department. And she studies the neurocognitive science of sleep, dreams, and mental health. This is a very important and growing field, really, the whole idea of treating sleep disorders and what that can do for mental health issues and et cetera. What it tells us about those issues as well. Michelle received her doctorate, PhD in biomedical sciences from the University of Montreal in 2016, where she studied the influence of nightmares on REM sleep functions at the Dream and Nightmare Laboratory, which sounds like it would be a very fun place to work. And then she completed postdoctoral training at the Swansea University Sleep Laboratory in the UK, studying the neurophysiology of nightmares and lucid dream induction and phenomenology, which is where you kind of wake up in your dream and can take an active role. She has currently over 30 publications on sleep, dreams, and nightmares, and is the leading author on the clinical significance of nightmares and multiple chapters on that topic in the book, Principles and Practices of Sleep Medicine. Her current research program includes studies of normal sleep and dream function and the psychopathology of nightmares and other dream disturbances and dream engineering, which is, I guess, a new term for a set of techniques and technologies designed to influence dreams to help people's mental health and feeling of well-being. On those topics, Michelle also trained in addition to her postdoc, as a visiting researcher at the Lausanne Center for Sleep Investigations in Switzerland and at Turku University in Finland to study neuroimaging of nightmares. And then back in this country at the MIT Media Laboratory, where she led the organization of the first International Dream Engineering Workshop and served as a guest editor for a special issue of Consciousness and Cognition on Dream Engineering. So she has quite a lot of experience for a postdoc. And we hope that she'll be part of a growing sleep research program in our department. So without any further delay, let me introduce Michelle Carr, and I look forward to hearing your questions at the end.
Thank you, Steve, for the introduction and for the music selection at the beginning. As said, I'm Michelle Carr, a postdoctoral associate in psychiatry, and I'm going to be presenting mainly on one area of my research about nightmares and nightmare treatment. But just to start with a little bit of backstory, I actually first worked in the sleep lab at the University of Rochester in 2008 as an undergraduate research assistant. It was my first research experience, and it was also the same year that I had my first ever lucid dream experience. So in this dream, I thought I had woken up, and I sat up out of my bed and looked back, and I could see that my my body was still lying asleep in bed. So I was literally beside myself as I realized I was inside of a dream. And I just remember being really amazed at how vivid and real the dream felt. And since then, I really wanted to just study scientifically how our brain and our mind is capable of producing this reality simulation while we're asleep. So I've since really developed a research program on the neurocognitive science of sleep and dreams. And my work has kind of three main areas. So first looking at the structure and function of so-called normal dreams. So how does our brain and our mind create and use dreaming? And then assessing the causes and consequences and treatment of dream disturbances like nightmares. And finally, dream engineering is a new topic that I'm working on, and hopefully I'll have some time to talk about it at the end. As said, I'm mainly going to focus on nightmares, but I'll just present a little bit on structure and function of dreaming just to start. So starting with dream structure, the main thing we're asking is how are dreams produced? What types of memories get incorporated into dreams, and how is this related to the physiology of sleep? So one protocol we use, and that I just finished data collection for a study using this serial awakenings protocol. And it's basically where we wake people up to 16 times during the night and collect brief dream reports so that we can see how dream content changes across a night of sleep and in different sleep stages. So one thing we're looking at, and we're trying to replicate a prior study, which showed that early in the night, your dreams tend to incorporate more recent memories, whereas as the night goes on, you start to incorporate more remote and earlier memories. So we're trying to look at what is the temporal recency of memories that get incorporated into dreams, and how does this relate to other dream qualities such as emotion and bizarreness. And just to give an example, so once when I was a participant in a study in Montreal, I slept in the lab and I had a dream that that a little gray cat jumped up onto my bed, and I was in the bedroom in the sleep lab in the dream. And in the dream, I knew that that gray cat was actually my colleague, Lisa, who was the experimenter in the study. And it's really common for us to see dreams like this in the sleep lab. People incorporate the recent memory of the sleep lab, but they also incorporate earlier memories, maybe some part of their childhood home is in the bedroom, for example. So in my case, I have the recent memory of the sleep lab, but also a gray cat jumps on my bed. And this is because in my typical life, I have a gray cat that jumps on my bed every morning. So different memories are being incorporated together. And basically through studies like this, we can try to see how memories are processed in dreaming and whether that's related to functions of dreams. And to study dream function, we typically use sleep and learning protocols. So one project that I'm working on right now is basically this large database of sleep and learning studies. It's 9 studies, 3 overnight and 6 nap studies, where people did learning tasks before sleep and after sleep. And we also collected dream reports. So we can look at how sleep and dream content is related to performance on a task. And from this database, we have one publication that's coming out now. And basically we found that, especially in morning REM sleep, people incorporate elements of the lab and of tasks into their dreams, and this can be associated with better task performance. I also have a study ongoing right now in the Rochester Sleep Lab, which is a similar study, but looking at American Sign Language vocabulary learning. So how is sleep and dreaming related to learning American Sign Language? And language learning has been studied quite a lot in the sleep and memory literature, but sign language is kind of unique in that it relies on semantic, but also visual, spatial, and motor learning. So it's kind of a new spin on studies that have been done before. Okay, so of course, understanding structure and function of normal dreams is informative for understanding what's going wrong when nightmares occur or when dreaming is disturbed. And this is going to be the main portion of my talk. So I just give like a really brief outline. I'm first going to talk about the neurocognitive model of nightmares and some empirical work that I've conducted, which supports this model. And then I'll discuss a newer kind of expanded version of the model that we published a few years ago called Differential Susceptibility, and particularly talking about a trait called sensory processing sensitivity. I'll get into all of that. And then finally, some of my newer work on lucid dreaming as a treatment for nightmares. Just some brief definitions. A dream is really any cognitive activity that can be remembered from sleep. Typical dreams incorporate recent waking life experiences. They can be very mundane, or they can be positive, or they can be lucid. I'll talk about that at the end of this talk. And you can dream in any sleep stage, although there is some variation, and REM sleep dreams are the most vivid and emotional. Nightmares are typically a disruption that occurs during REM sleep, and they're intensely negative and well-recalled dreams that often involve efforts to avoid threats to survival or security or physical integrity. Researchers tend to use the awakening criterion to distinguish bad dreams from nightmares. So a bad dream is just a mild negative dream that you remember naturally after awakening, whereas a nightmare actually causes you to wake up because it's so negative. And about 5% of the population have nightmare disorder, which is at least weekly occurring distressing nightmares that interfere with waking life. So the neurocognitive model of nightmares is developed by my PhD supervisor, Tori Nielsen, and his colleague, Ross Levin. And it's a model that looks at how nightmares are formed and how they can develop into psychopathology. And it has both neural and cognitive levels of explanation. So at a cognitive level, the first idea is that actually experiencing bad dreams and nightmares is a normal response to waking life stress. And these bad dreams actually serve a function in helping us to adapt to emotional experiences. But then there are certain individuals who have this trait called affect distress, which essentially causes them to experience more distress in response to nightmares and to develop pathological symptoms that maintain and exacerbate, like poor sleep and nightmare production. So the trait is kind of similar in, if you know, like the trait of negative emotionality. So it's just a tendency to experience negative reactions and distress in response to negative experiences. So that's kind of the cognitive level of explanation. At a neural level, the model describes in more detail this hypothesized function of bad dreams in adaptation to emotional experiences and how nightmares then disrupt this function. So this model focuses largely on 4 brain regions, the amygdala and hippocampus, and then cortical regions, the medial prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex. And in general, it postulates that during bad dreams, the amygdala kind of activates emotional arousal and fear memories, and the hippocampus provides novel contextual memories to associate with negative memories. So it's in essence recombining negative with neutral or positive memories in order to help us to adapt to negative experiences. And then at a cortical level, the medial prefrontal cortex kind of allows us to form these new kind of associated integrated memories, and both the prefrontal and anterior cingulate cortex help with regulating emotion during the experience. So in the model, people with nightmares or those who are high in that trait, affect distress, experience increased arousal and a deficit in regulation, which causes this process to fail, leading to recurrent nightmares and also associated with emotion dysregulation in waking as well. So it kind of causes this vicious cycle of being distressed during the day and producing nightmares and feeling distressed in response to them. So we plan to test some of the predictions of this model, mainly the predictions about arousal and emotion regulation in waking life as kind of a trait factor characterizing nightmare sufferers. So for this, we recruited 23 nightmare participants who recalled at least 2 bad dreams or 1 nightmare per week, and 18 control subjects who have less than 1 nightmare per month. And all of the subjects completed the nightmare distress questionnaire and a measure of nightmare frequency. And they completed 2 waking state tasks, so the verbal fluency task and also an emotional arousal task with high resolution SPECT imaging. So the verbal fluency task is a neuropsychological measure of executive function or frontal regulatory function. So for this task, participants are asked to list as many words as they can that either start with a certain letter or fit into a certain category in 60 seconds. And critically, participants are told not to repeat themselves. So if they do repeat themselves, this is a form of perseveration, and it suggests a failure to inhibit or to regulate your responses. So we did this, assess this task, and we were actually replicating a prior study done in 2012. And both the original study and our replication show that nightmare sufferers have increased perseveration on this task. The original study was in a Hungarian sample, and we did it in a sample of French speakers. And in addition, we found in our sample that actually in the nightmare subjects, perseveration rate is correlated with nightmare frequency. So the more nightmares you have, the more perseveration errors you commit. The other waking state task we conducted in a subset of 18 nightmare participants. And here's our protocol. It was actually really relatively straightforward. We just had participants viewing negative pictures during 8 minutes. There were 48 negative pictures, and subsequently responding to how emotionally aroused they felt. But while they were viewing the images, and especially kind of after, well, nearing the end of viewing pictures when they were supposedly emotionally aroused, we injected a radio tracer, and following the picture viewing, then we could image how that radio tracer was dispersing using SPECT imaging. So we also, to try to improve mood, we played a short cartoon cat video to make people feel less distressed after these negative images. So yeah, that's a picture of the SPECT scanner. And this is what the imaging looks like prior to analysis. So our first set of results is basically correlating activation in brain regions and nightmare distress during this negative picture viewing task. So what we see is there's a high preponderance of negative correlations between regional cerebral blood flow and nightmare distress, in particular in bilateral, you don't have to remember all these, I'm just going to list them. Bilateral cingulate gyrus, right medial frontal gyrus, right inferior frontal gyrus, left precentral gyrus, and bilateral anterior insula. I will summarize this in a later slide. So this is just to show the results that we got. So these are correlations with nightmare distress, a negative correlation. So the more nightmare distress you have, the less activation we see in these regions, or the less cerebral blood flow. We also looked at correlations with bad dream frequency and found similar negative correlations between cerebral blood flow and bad dream frequency in left anterior cingulate gyrus, bilateral medial frontal gyrus, left middle frontal gyrus, bilateral inferior frontal gyrus, and insula. So in kind of combining these findings, basically these findings are consistent with the possibility of a waking deficit in regulatory control. And our neuroimaging findings, we didn't find any findings for regions like the amygdala and hippocampus, which we were predicting by the neurocognitive model. Instead, it seems like there's more, the findings were stronger for these areas associated with emotion regulation. So they basically indicate that reductions in waking cortical regions involved in emotion regulation may constitute our best kind of neural correlate of the nightmare sufferer. Some of the regions that weren't originally in the model, such as the insula, are also consistent with emotion regulation explanations and are also involved in REM circuitry. Yeah, I think I just also wanted to mention in general those regions that I was listing. So those that are in the neurocognitive model, but also the additional ones we found, such as superior temporal, anterior insular, medial frontal, and anterior cingulate gyri, are all active in REM sleep and could play a role in this kind of supposed dream function in regulating and adapting to emotional experiences. Then more generally, I just wanted to highlight that this model is kind of consistent with this broader framework in psychiatry, these diathesis stress models. And in this case, the trait of affect distress is thought to be a risk factor, which predisposes individuals to experience increased nightmares and emotion dysregulation at both a neural and a cognitive level. So generally, a lot of the findings in the nightmare literature accord with this diathesis stress model. So for example, having a history of adversity or trauma increases nightmare frequency and distress, and nightmares are associated with increased waking symptoms of anxiety, depression, suicide risk, and worse symptoms in insomnia, PTSD, and schizophrenia, just to name a few. So in general, it seems like nightmares could be a transdiagnostic risk factor and symptom in psychiatric disorders. And because of that, one of the kind of goals of my work in the psychiatry department is to see how nightmares may affect mental health in other clinical populations. So we've done this so far and are planning to do this just through conducting observational studies looking at sleep and dreams in diaries or using wearable technologies, and just measuring how nightmares and maybe this trait affect distress may be associated with worse symptoms and outcomes in psychiatric disorders. So then in 2017, I actually published with my Tori Nielsen an expanded version of the neurocognitive model, which looks like this. And it's very similar to what I just showed you with just a diathesis stress model. The only thing that's different or that is added is in that upper right quadrant of the figure. And it's basically a differential susceptibility framework. And basically differential susceptibility just means that these traits are for better and for worse traits. So even though with nightmares, we think that having affect distress is associated with worse nightmare distress and worse outcomes like anxiety and depression. So that's the kind of the lower left quadrant. It also seems like that same trait could potentially be beneficial when somebody is exposed to positive or supportive contexts. And basically, this paper or this review that we published grew out of kind of building findings in our group and in others that suggest that nightmare sufferers also have some of these adaptive or advantageous traits that are in that upper right quadrant of the figure. So we basically compiled all of the work on this upside of having nightmares and mapped it onto this differential susceptibility framework. So in particular, the trait marker that we looked at or that we suggested is characterizing nightmare sufferers is this trait of sensory processing sensitivity. And this can be defined as increased emotional reactivity, but for both negative and positive valences, which underlies a heightened processing and awareness of environmental stimuli. So basically, because the environment is more emotional and salient to these individuals, they process it more deeply. So on the one hand, this can be associated with negative outcomes, particularly in response to very arousing or very arousing stimuli. but it can also be associated with positive outcomes. So being more aware of subtleties in the environment and being more responsive to positive contexts. So we kind of mapped the profile of nightmare sufferers onto the existing literature about sensory processing sensitivity. And there's a variety of behavioral evidence that aligns with this trait. I won't go into detail, but just for example, we found that nightmare sufferers have increased curiosity and reward seeking, increased perceptual sensitivity, heightened empathy and mirror behaviors, and increased cognitive processing, evidenced on a semantic task. And all of this is really similar to findings in the sensory processing sensitivity literature. So what was kind of fun about the paper is that we added onto this existing literature kind of all of the unique findings from the nightmare literature about internal environments, internal imagery. So we know that nightmare sufferers have, of course, nightmares, but we also see a lot of evidence that they also have more vivid imagery in general. And this even includes intense positive imagery. So we see that nightmare sufferers have more vivid and bizarre daydreams, higher recall of neutral, positive, and even intensely positive dream experiences like lucid dreams. They have more sensory vividness and more social interactions in their dreams. And in general, we are suggesting that being highly sensitive is not just a sensitivity to the external environment, but this is also expressed in vivid and intensified internal stimulation, so imagery, dreaming, daydreams. So in order to more test the predictions of this model, we conducted a study during my first postdoc in Swansea. And for this, we recruited 54 participants, and they were split according to a nightmare distress questionnaire. And everyone completed a variety of questionnaire measures designed to assess both negative and positive waking and dreaming features. And all of the participants completed a negative and positive emotional arousal task while recorded with near-infrared spectroscopy. They kept dream and mood diaries for up to 8 weeks and also completed imagery rescripting sessions. So I'll talk about that in more detail soon. Our questionnaire results showed some support for the model. Nightmare sufferers scored much higher on the highly sensitive person scale, which is designed to measure sensory processing sensitivity. So the scale has items like I'm very sensitive to bright lights and loud noises, or I'm easily moved by the arts and music. So it's sensory, emotional, and aesthetic sensitivity. Nightmare participants also tended to score higher on empathy, but also, of course, as expected, also on personal distress and lower in well-being. So those are the questionnaire results. For the task, all of the participants completed an emotional picture viewing task, and this was a negative and positive picture viewing task, similar to the study we did in Montreal. And we had them rate their subjective arousal during the task, and from this we saw that the nightmare participants do have higher subjective arousal in response to both negative and positive pictures. We also, in a subset of participants, so 18 nightmare participants who met a cutoff of at least 2 bad dreams or 1 nightmare per week, were recorded by frontal near-infrared spectroscopy. So that we used 8 optodes that emit infrared light across the skull and cortex, and then receivers measure kind of how the light scatters, and from that can detect changes in blood flow or changes in blood oxygenation. And basically we partially replicated the finding from the Montreal study, which is that nightmare distress was negatively correlated with frontal activation during negative picture viewing. So the more nightmare distress you have, the less frontal activation when you're negatively aroused. But this finding did not extend to the positive picture viewing task. Next, the dream and mood diaries. So participants kept 8-week daily diaries where they rated their dream, emotion, and their morning mood. And we conducted repeated measures correlations, which basically within participants correlate daily dream emotion with waking emotion, and then between participants also looks at correlations between the two. And basically we see that, yes, on days when people have more negative dreams, they have more negative waking mood. And on days with more positive dreams, people have more positive mood, which is actually a relatively new finding and is nice because it's kind of analogous to nightmare distress. So actually having positive moods, positive dreams can be beneficial to waking mood. We then conducted text analysis to look at other content categories that might be associated with morning mood. On the left side, I'm not going to go through all of these, but on the left-hand side is emotion categories. So again, we see more anxious dreams are associated with more negative mood, whereas more positive dreams, that's the green bar, is associated with less negative waking mood. I think the other one I wanted to talk about is characters. So yeah, this was interesting in that dreams that have more I pronouns, so singular first person pronouns, dreams that have more I pronouns are associated with more negative mood in the morning, whereas dreams that have more we pronouns, so first person plural pronouns, are associated with less negative mood. So that's some indication that perhaps the social quality of dreaming is important for waking mood. Okay, I'm going to talk about the next results and then I'll summarize all of these. So we also did waking imagery rescripting for bad dreams, and imagery rescripting is actually the main treatment that is available for nightmares right now. And just to give an example, so we did this rescripting on dreams that participants reported during the dream diary. So this participant has a dream of being trapped in a prison cell that had black and white floor tiles. And on the opposite wall, there was a door that was slowly opening as if it was haunted. And the dreamer was frozen in fear. So during a waking rescripting exercise, the dreamer imagined being in the cell, but now she imagined standing in a row, holding hands with other people. And as she was imagining this, the imagery spontaneously changed. So she said the floor tiles extended out in front of her, kind of like an optical illusion, and the wall was pulled further and further away from her. And she felt completely calm and relieved in the dream now, or in the image now. So we're currently conducting qualitative analysis on these rescripting sessions. And one thing that we are seeing, which wasn't necessarily predicted, is how dreams are shifting towards more positive experiences. So a typical nightmare has reactions like fear and avoidance and feelings of helplessness. And what we're seeing is when people rescript them towards more positive experiences, first, we'll see that the dreamer has some sense of security or safety because they're doing this as a waking exercise. They're not in the nightmare. So they have some sense of self-control. But then the unexpected thing is that we also see frequently the incorporation of social content. So dreams are kind of rescripting towards more positive social experiences. And that's really interesting. And it kind of lines up with the finding that I just talked about in the last slide, that more positive and social dreams seem to be associated with more positive mood. But that's something we're still analyzing now. On the quantitative side, participating in these rescripting exercises led to improved attitude towards dreams and also a trend to increased lucidity, so more awareness and control in dreams following rescripting. So In sum, the main findings of this study are that nightmare sufferers seem to have bivalent emotional reactivity, so both negative and positive. And the questionnaire measures, we did see some indication of positive traits like sensory processing, sensitivity, and empathy, but of course also worse well-being and distress. The dream and mood diaries support that positive dream experiences can boost waking mood, kind of analogous to nightmare distress. And when rescripting bad dreams or when experiencing dreams, positive social content might particularly benefit dreamers and lead a feeling of kind of a shifting attitude towards dreams. So yeah, this shift from more helpless and afraid in dreams to being more empowered and in control, and perhaps with the help of other dream characters. In the differential susceptibility paper, we kind of conceptualize this as downward versus upward spirals between sleeping and mood. So while highly sensitive individuals would be more prone to nightmares, this is that vicious cycle I talked about earlier. They're more prone to experience nightmares in response to negative experiences and to develop distress and waking affective symptoms like anxiety and depression. But the upward spiral may likewise occur in highly sensitive individuals. That is, they can experience positive waking and dream experiences, which feed upward into better waking mood and greater well-being in waking life. So one thing I want to come back to is that neural finding we still specifically found less frontal activation during the negative picture viewing task and not the positive task. And this is kind of tying in with the lucid dreaming idea well, in that we are thinking that emotion regulation might be kind of a core mechanism and a core kind of treatment target for improving nightmares and shifting people into this upward spiral of more positive dreams and mood. So talking about lucid dreaming treatment, lucid dream is when you are aware of the fact that you're dreaming while still asleep. And in some cases, you can actually control yourself as the dreamer. So you could choose how to react to a situation or choose an action you want to take in the dream. Or you might even be able to control aspects of the dream content. So you might be able to make someone disappear, for example. In theory, there's several neurocognitive mechanisms of lucid dreaming treatment, or LDT, that line up with the neurocognitive model of nightmares. So this figure is, again, just the downward and upward spirals that I showed in the last summary page. But I've added some yellow highlights to suggested components and mechanisms of lucid dreaming treatment. So in particular, along the central is the component, along the center of the spiral is emotion regulation. So in the downward spiral, we see there's frequently these maladaptive emotion regulation responses, such as avoidance and helplessness, which people frequently experience in response to nightmares. But then going into the upward spiral are more adaptive emotion regulation skills like awareness and control. And lucid dreaming may be unique in being able to enhance awareness and control while you're actually in the REM sleep dreaming state. So as an example, here's an example from a patient that was going through lucid dreaming treatment. And she had these dreams over the course of the treatment. So in the first example, she dreams again that her ex-husband is chasing her in a car. And at some point, she realizes that she's dreaming and she simply yells stop and wakes up. And at another point during treatment, she has a dream that her ex is chasing her by a car again. This time when she realizes she's dreaming, she calls for help, and many people came out of their houses, and together they walked towards him and he disappeared. So we can see that initially the dreamer has this awareness that enters into the nightmare, which can help regulate emotion, but then later she actually has some agency and control in the dream, and this shifts the nightmare into a more positive dream experience. Just returning to the upward spiral on the left, the other features that are highlighted there are just that lucid dreams might enhance positive affect in dreams and in waking mood as well. And this is another thing that we've studied a bit using in non-clinical samples so far. So those are a couple studies that we did, home-based studies where people practiced lucid dreaming techniques and kept diaries. And we basically found that the more lucid your dreams are, the more positive your mood in the morning. So one limitation of existing lucid dreaming studies is that they're primarily done at home. And this is because it's actually quite difficult to induce lucid dreams on command. So typically people will just practice techniques over the course of a month or two, like setting intentions to become lucid or visualizing dreams and imagining becoming lucid. And they can do these techniques either right before sleep or during the early morning. They wake up during sleep and practice these techniques. And when people do this, they might have like one lucid dream during a week, but we can't really predict when that will happen. So there's relatively few laboratory studies of lucid dreaming and no laboratory studies of lucid dreaming treatment. So because of this, and because one of the main questions that I want to ask is lucid dreaming actually affecting frontal activation during REM sleep? And is that a mechanism? How does lucid dreaming improve emotion regulation during REM sleep? And how does that associate with outcomes? So because that's one of my questions, a primary thing we have to do is get better at inducing lucid dreams in the laboratory. So this was another study we conducted at Swansea that aimed to induce lucid dreams with high reliability in the lab. And we developed this protocol called targeted lucidity reactivation. And it's based on similar work in sleep and memory called targeted memory reactivation. And it's basically you pair a cognitive task with a sensory cue while you're awake. And then when the person is asleep, you represent the sensory cue and it should reactivate the associated cognitive content. So in targeted lucidity reactivation, we invited people into the lab, and for 20 minutes prior to sleep, they're lying in bed and we're presenting these alternating auditory and visual cues, a beeping sound or a flashing light, LED light. And as those cues are presented, participants are prompted to become lucid or to practice this mind state of becoming lucid. So paying attention to their thoughts and their experiences and just basically remaining conscious of what they're experiencing. So then people took a nap in the lab, and when they entered REM sleep, we represented these sensory cues. And we told people, if you notice these cues in your dream and you become lucid, then you can signal to us that you're lucid by looking left and right with your eyes. And this is because as people are sleeping, we're recording their eye movements with electrodes. And so when somebody looks left and right 4 times very quickly, we can see that very clearly on the EOG trace. And so we know that they're lucid. Finally, after REM sleep, we wake people up and get a dream report. So this is one example of a participant who was in a lucid dream, and she noticed that she was in a supermarket in the dream, and she noticed that the lights in the supermarket flickered. And then she noticed that the text messages on her phone was this beeping sound, and she recognized that these were the sensory cues from the experimenters. And so she became lucid and gave us the eye signal to indicate that she was lucid. And we also had people respond to this questionnaire, the lucid scale that just measures levels of insight and cognition and emotion in dreams. So our results, one thing I didn't mention, we had 2 groups of participants, 28 participants we presented the cues during REM sleep, and 12 of them were a control group, and we didn't present the cues during REM sleep. And so these are our results comparing those people who were cued with those who were not cued. And the main finding is that 50% of cued participants were able to have signal verified lucid dreams. So they gave the eye signal and they reported being lucid following one nap in the laboratory. And then on the right, we have ratings on that lucid questionnaire. And again, people in the cued group had higher levels of insight and memory in their dreams and less negative emotion. So the 50% induction rate is actually, that's relatively high. That's as high as we get in lucid dreaming studies. So it's a good finding, but it could still use room for improvement. We also, in our sample, we particularly recruited some people who had bad dreams and nightmares because of my interest in using this as a treatment, and conducted some regression analyses and found that actually having higher nightmare distress seemed to even perhaps make the protocol work better. So having higher nightmare distress was associated with having more lucid dreams and more cue incorporation, so perhaps more sensory processing during sleep, and higher scores on that lucid questionnaire. So in sum, the targeted lucidity reactivation protocol seems effective for inducing lucid dreams, and perhaps especially in nightmare subjects, and may be able to be used to study neurocognitive mechanisms of lucid dreaming therapy. And I just want to talk about this other recent study really quickly. I know I'm almost out of time. So there was another study that was published in Current Biology this year that used the targeted lucidity reactivation protocol to induce lucid dreams in people in the lab. And this is a participant who's giving the lucid dreaming eye signal here. And then the experimenters just presented spoken math problems to participants. So in this case, they presented the speech, what is 8 minus 6? And the lucid dreamer had to respond with eye signals. So in this case, the lucid dreamer gives 2 left-right eye signals to indicate they've understood the question is 8 minus 6, and they've computed the answer and given it to the experimenter. And this is really cool because it's possible that maybe sometime in the future we could actually present spoken prompts to somebody in nightmare treatment, for example, reminding them of how to confront the nightmare or how to use their rescripted image to overcome a nightmare while it's occurring. Future work. More basically, some future work I'm hoping to do is just looking at how lucid dreaming treatment or other nightmare treatments could improve other symptoms or outcomes in psychiatric disorders. And this is actually my current supervisor, Will Pigeon, has done a ton of work looking at how treating insomnia improves symptoms in comorbid disorders. So treating insomnia improves chronic pain symptoms, for example. So I would like to do a similar thing, but looking at treating nightmares and potentially with lucid dreaming. I don't really have time for this, and I wasn't going to say much about it anyways, but basically this dream engineering project is a new collaborative project that I'm working on with a group at the MIT Media Laboratory. And basically what it's doing is just looking at how we can manipulate dreams as they are occurring. So rather than doing some sort of waking imagery rescripting or lucid dreaming training, how can we apply sensory stimulation while someone's dreaming to just directly influence dreams? And we published this theory paper, which just talks a lot about how kind of traditionally we think of dreams as being something that's just occurring in the brain and in the mind. But in reality, the body is very active and important to dreaming. And so we can use the body kind of as a sensory interface and actively influence dreams through bodily stimulation during sleep. So that's all I'll say about that. If you're curious, you can check out this special issue. The editorial is like a really short 2-page overview of what is dream engineering, what are people working on, and reviews the other papers in the issue. So that's it. Thank you all for listening, and I hope I can answer some of your questions. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Michelle. That was fascinating and an excellent presentation. And we do have some questions, and I'll see how many we can get through. The first question is whether post-traumatic trauma or PTSD type symptoms have been examined as a moderator and or a mediator in any studies of the kind of studies you talked about. That is, are the findings different for people with nightmares and a trauma background compared to people who may have nightmares without a trauma background?
Yeah, it's a good question. So of course, yeah, nightmares are one of the kind of hallmark features of PTSD, but the nightmares in PTSD do seem to be more extreme and actually replicate the waking life trauma in kind of episodic detail, whereas idiopathic nightmares tend to be more dreamlike. They're not actually just replaying memories. And in the studies that I've done, which I think is the question is referring to, we actually specifically recruit people who don't have PTSD symptoms because we were really trying to just look at idiopathic nightmares. So in those samples, the 2 neuroimaging studies, there wouldn't be anyone above like kind of basic clinical cutoffs for PTSD symptoms. But the neurocognitive model is also based in the PTSD literature, and there are similar, I think, findings of, similar neuroimaging findings for patients with PTSD, but they're just more extreme, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. The second question is, what are your thoughts on imagery rehearsal therapy versus CBT for insomnia?
Well, imagery rehearsal therapy is specifically for nightmares, but often people have, they have symptoms of nightmares and insomnia, and the two can be combined. But I guess I'm not sure if they mean imagery rehearsal therapy for insomnia, but I don't know if that's a thing. But in general, people who have nightmares, if you treat them with imagery rehearsal therapy, not only do the nightmares decrease, but their sleep improves as well. CBTI, so CBT for insomnia, is more appropriate for patients who have disturbed sleep, like short sleep or a lot of awakenings, but don't have nightmares. So I think they're targeting different things and treating different aspects of sleep disorders, but they can be combined in people who have both.
Okay, great. Well, we have more questions. This one is, patients on psychotropics often report increased and more vivid dreaming. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I wish I had actual information about that. I know that that is an area of research, and so psychotropics are affecting REM sleep neurophysiology, and I wish I could give you specific information about that, but I mainly know this because in any studies where we're looking at REM sleep neurophysiology, we actually exclude people on psychotropics because their physiology is so different during REM sleep, and they do have these different vivid and also often bizarre bad dreams. So there's some change that's occurring in their REM sleep circuitry. Yeah.
So at the very least, I would suggest in any comprehensive nightmare treatment, you'd want to see what medications people are taking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, and our next question is there any evidence that the content of people's dreams is related to their psychological stressors or even their unconscious, as Freud put forward? And the person asking the question says he's curious how to review dream content with patients in therapy in an evidence-based fashion.
Yeah, so often, sorry?
You have 2 minutes to answer all of that.
2 minutes to get into Freud. Well, yeah, generally when we look at nightmare content, people tend to have recurring nightmare themes or nightmare scripts, and they do seem to be related to waking life. So one of the examples I gave of the patient who has this recurring nightmare of being chased by her ex-husband in a car. it incorporates kind of a clear indication of what is the waking life stressor that's triggering this nightmare, some memory about her ex-husband. But it's also kind of dreamlike in that he's chasing her in a car, which isn't anything that's ever happened in real life, but it's kind of a dream metaphor for being attacked or being just being chased or being threatened by her ex-husband. So, working with them in an evidence-based fashion, there is some new work, particularly if you are interested in that, I would suggest reading some of the books by or research papers by Leslie Ellis, who is really focused on making working with nightmares a more evidence-based and more kind of consistent and structured approach that fits within kind of more modern psychiatric approaches to treatment, and kind of like outlines like how can you work with nightmare imagery, relate it to waking life, and do so in a consistent and reliable manner. So that was Leslie Ellis. Yeah.
Okay, and the last question is, which and there's only 1 minute left now. Some of the characteristics of the people with nightmares that you mentioned in terms of imagery and sensory responsivity are similar to people who have high creativity or who have hallucinations or who are highly hypnotizable.
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder, is there any literature on nightmares relating to any of those phenomena? And can things like creativity and hypnosis be used to reduce nightmares?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another researcher, Ernest Hartman, actually did a lot of work on that and on the construct of boundary thinness and how people who have nightmares, it's not just emotion and sensory sensitivity, but there seems to be kind of a proneness to cognitive disorganization and to increased like bizarreness and associativity in thoughts. And that's kind of another area of my research actually, but yeah, nightmare sufferers have higher hypnotizability, they have higher absorption and fantasy proneness, schizotypal symptoms. So that does seem to be another feature of this kind of imaginative richness, which maybe, yeah, could be another pathway to treatment using hypnosis. I don't think that's been studied at all, which would be interesting.
All right, thanks. Well, I wish you had more time. This was really interesting, and there are so many applications of this work, and look forward to seeing it. So thank you again, Michelle, and thank you everyone for coming. Please remember to complete the evaluation. It's in the chat box now. There'll also be an email that's sent out later and a slide put up at the very end here. All right, so thank you, and I'll see you all at next month's Engel rounds.
Thank you, everyone. See you.